Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Chip Chapley, and thank you for joining us in today's discussion. Today's topic is about the Berlin bombing, and I am joined today by Owen Weatherspoon, who will be defending the British bombing force, and Adam Weber, who will be defending the German citizens. So first, what actually was the Berlin bombing? Adam?
Well, Chip, Berlin was the capital of Nazi Germany, and the Berlin bombing was a series of air raids led by the Allied forces. There were 363 raids that the Allies launched on Berlin during the Second World War. It was bombed between 1940 and 1945, and was labeled the strategic bombing of Germany. However, I feel the name is very ironic, as the placements of the British bomb strikes were anything but strategic, bombing random houses and civilian positions.
Well, hold on now. The British bombing was a very strategic and very important move for the Allied war campaign, and without it, the war might have taken longer.
How? All they did was bomb German cities randomly.
It was not random. They had scouts on their bombers that could... Hold up there, guys. This is too soon for that. You can debate it later. First, let Adam finish.
Fine. The city of Berlin wasn't only bombed by the Western Allied forces, as the Red Army bombed the city many times, especially during 1945, while the Soviet forces were advancing on the city after the German defeat in Stalingrad. The British bombers dropped more than 45,517 tons of bombs, while the Americans dropped 23 tons. As the bombing continued, more and more people moved out, and by May of 1945, 1.3 million people, or 40% of the city's population, had fled.
Thanks, mate. Now, debate to your heart's content. What caused the British to start bombing German civilian populations? Or who started it in the first place? Well, it was the Germans who started it, as it was a retaliation from the way the Germans shelled the Dutch city of Rotterdam. Even though a surrender had already been negotiated. Originally, the British had been against shelling civilian positions, but after the British heard about Rotterdam, they started to tell themselves that Germany can take it.
But even the Germans were ashamed of that. The attack on the Dutch was launched because it was in between Germany and England, and the plan to take Rotterdam had been set days before. The bombings on Rotterdam were meant to be on factories and behind Dutch lines to support the Germans that were fighting their way into the city. However, the first attack was meant to be a scare tactic, and when the Air Force didn't see anyone fighting, they knew something was wrong and retreated. But it was after the shelling of the non-evacuated zone.
It was a mistake isn't much of an excuse when the surrender had been agreed on hours beforehand. Besides, they could have started with the factories. Why would they even waste the bombs on civilian zones?
Well, the reason that they bombed civilian positions, doesn't matter what bombing, Rotterdam, Berlin, or London, they were all for one thing. Studies show that killing someone isn't as damaging to morale as making them homeless. If you take out their source of home, their source of warmth, and source of food, it demoralizes the enemy much more than if you were just to kill them. To kill is to use a catalyst to make people more fired up and willing to fight back. But to lose their home and their possessions is just more crushing. That's why they would have wasted bombs on civilian positions, even if it is awful. The main reason that they bombed that zone, though, is because they assumed it would be evacuated, due to the fact that it was super close to German lines. But the crazy Dutch decided not to evacuate.
Okay, I do kind of have to agree with that. Like, by bombing the civilian cities, it helped stop the flow of tanks and trucks, and somewhat ground forces, from reaching the front lines. And it also can delay the flow of supplies like extra ammo and food and water if there's like a broken building that is completely cut off a street that they were using before. Yeah. So I guess strategically it could have been a good move, but only if it was cutting off the supply lines, which at the time there were none. So it was completely unjustified and had no real reason to happen other than the fact just that they wanted to cause terror.
That's not the point, though. The bombing wasn't meant to cut off any supply lines. It was meant to destroy and demoralize the will of the Dutch people by making them homeless. It was a reckless move, sure, but in wartime you have to suspend your morale. Like I said before, they thought that area was evacuated, and it was really a mistake and a miscalculation.
Well, this is starting to go in circles. Let's move on to the next question, shall we? So, because of all the bombings between Berlin and England, what exactly was gained from all that destruction? Well, just like Adam had stated multiple times before, it weakened the morals of the citizens on both sides. As Britain was bombing the capital of Germany, it showed that no place was safe from the air raids.
Yeah, and as Germany had started to bomb England, it scared them into making underground bunkers, or forced them to hide in subways in the middle of the night. Although the Brits were crazier than the Germans, as when survivors were asked after the war, some of the British people said they actually missed spending time in the bunkers and the tunnels, as it was kind of a social gathering while bombs exploded above their heads. Meanwhile, any German citizens were just terrified out of their minds, and said they never wanted to relive those nights again. While both sides bombed and attacked each other, the British bombings were more ruthless and more frequent throughout the war, as London had fewer attacks on it than any of the German cities. So therefore, the British bombing was much worse than the German bombing, and they started it as well, as for the fact that they were choosing to bomb civilian positions rather than just getting caught up in the warfare, and bombing a place that wasn't on a battlefield, unlike Rotterdam. The British are the ones at fault for the entire incident, and they were the only ones that benefited from it after the war. But it should be known that this is an atrocity and should never be repeated by anybody in further wars.
Well, that's not really fair to say, because if Germany had just stayed down after the First World War, those bombings never would have ever happened. So, sure, it might have seemed harsh, but I believe that after only 21 years of peace, that people were still fed up with the war. And as the effects of the First World War were still there, and even with all the rebuilding, it was still fresh in people's minds.
Well, that's a weak argument, because the Second World War did start. Hitler wanted the parts of Germany that had been sectioned off by the Treaty of Versailles, and the people in those parts wanted to become part of Germany again. So it's not really the fact that World War II started that caused the bombings. It's more the fact that the British decided to bomb the civilian positions. The studies show that during the first 4 years of the war, Britain did just target random civilian positions trying to demoralize the Germans, but they were more resilient than they originally thought. So then they targeted railway stations and other places of traffic like main roads, and it basically paralyzed Germany. At the end of the war, they found over 150 tanks sitting in a shipyard waiting to be shipped out to the front, but they had no way of getting there because all the railways had been destroyed. If they'd just done that from the beginning, then the Germans wouldn't have stood much of a chance. But out of spite, they just chose to bomb random positions and wasted thousands and hundreds of lives.
Well, okay, maybe the bombing was a little flawed, but it still helped in the long run with the Allies still winning the battle in the end. Okay, well then, how about we move on to the last question? So after World War II ended, what are the after effects of today's day and age left by those specific bombings? After the Germans had bombed Britain, unexploded bombs were left behind as more bombs had been dropped, burying the earlier dropped bombs. And now, every once in a while, when there is maybe like some road work or new housing is coming in, they might uncover some unexploded bomb, which can delay everything as the construction workers have to leave, and traffic will have to be rerouted. The entire area will have to be evacuated, and then you'll have to bring in special forces to come and make sure the bomb can safely be brought out.
Well, the main problem with the British bombs is they were being pumped out as fast as possible, and there were a lot of faulty ones that didn't explode, like the one found in central Berlin in 2013. This bomb had to be defused by a team of experts because it was uncovered during some construction of a railway and didn't explode, and was identified to be one of the ones dropped by the Allies in World War II.
Well, I am so sorry to say this, but it appears we are all out of time for today. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening. I am Chip Chapley, and you have just listened to the debate about the Berlin bombing. And thank you, Owen and Adam, for joining me today. I hope to see you again sometime soon. Thank you, and have a good night.
This podcast was made by Owen Witherspoon and Adam Weber. Credit to Rooster Teeth for intro and outro music.